Optimism is the stubbornness of maintaining that everything is best when it is worst. I have a confession to make. I am a natural optimist, almost to the point of naivety. I broadly tend to overestimate how well things will pan out, and am surprised when they inevitably do not go according to plan. And the thing is, I am not alone. If you believe many psychologists, most of us are prone to this sort of optimistic bias, where we are far too positive in our predictions of how life will go for us. But this is a philosophy channel, and in that vein, I ought to put my own predisposition to the test. So today, we are going to look at some of the most ardent critiques of optimism from across history, and see whether there is truly any wisdom in being an optimist. For my purposes here, I will define an optimist very broadly as someone who views things as better than they are, and I'll go into specifics later in the video. Get ready to learn the different forms of optimism, how the optimist can quickly morph into a cynic, and how we may be able to look the sufferings of the world in the face and still remain positive. As always, bear in mind that this is just a taste of the literature out there on this topic. And also that since I'm attempting to criticize my own position, there will not be much defense of optimism in this video until right at the very end. Also, the words optimism and optimist are going to completely lose meaning for me in about 2 minutes. So, let's begin by looking at one of the classic problems for the optimist, that they try to justify the unjustifiable. But before we get into that, I want to take a brief moment to thank today's very kind sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning platform with classes on various topics. You can learn anything from painting skills to party tricks to web design. I've now finished the class I was taking on interior design, and it helped me pick out my lamp and my bookshelf, so I'm pretty happy with that. I'm still working through Skillshare's cooking classes, but I do think I've got a fair bit better. I even made a pretty decent risotto the other day, so that was really nice and also saved me having either nuts or McDonald's for dinner. Skillshare is a long-term sponsor of the channel because it is a fantastic platform for feeding your curiosity. I've taken classes in touch typing and massage and video editing, and I love accumulating all of these little hobbies. They just make life a bit more colourful. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so check it out. And thank you, my dear viewer, for watching this interlude the whole way through. 1. The best of all possible worlds. Among Gottfried Leibniz's many achievements are huge innovations in calculus, a metaphysics whose sophistication was even admired by Bertrand Russell, and the title of the last universal genius. However, he also came up with an infamous form of optimism that has survived in new guises in the present day. Leibniz believed that there was an all-powerful and all-loving God, but at the same time he rubbed up against the existence of evil in the world. So he came up with a proposed solution. Since God would not create anything less than the best world he could, and since he is omnipotent, this must be the best of all possible worlds. There simply could not be a world that is better than this one. Obviously, I am slightly simplifying Leibniz's point here, but you get the picture. Despite being widely criticized for this, Leibniz's optimism is still found in a modified form today. Perhaps it is most prominent in sayings like everything is for the best or everything happens for a reason, with the implicit assumption that this must be a good reason. These all basically amount to the same proposition, that our world, the one we inhabit right now, is the best world that even can be. Every event that happens is part of a plan or purpose that is unassailably good, and in some cases not just good, but the best possible plan anyone could come up with. This is slightly broader in scope than Leibniz's original position, but I'm going to dub all of these views Leibnizian optimism for the sake of convenience. Leibnizian optimism is importantly different from some of the other types of optimism that we will discuss later, because it does not make predictions about what specifically will happen, only that whatever does happen will be in some way good. And not just good subjectively, but good objectively. Everything is and always will be as it should be. This makes it somewhat retrospective as an optimistic doctrine, but nonetheless it is still a pretty prevalent standpoint in the received wisdom of our day. This is also a type of optimism that I think is ripe for criticism. And perhaps the most famous example of this is found in the work of French philosopher Voltaire. In his novel Candide, he outlines 2 main problems with the Leibnizian view. The first is that it discourages action, and the second is that it tries to avoid acknowledging the genuine horrors of the world. For instance, at one point in the tale, Candide goes to rescue a man from a shipwreck, but he is stopped by his philosopher friend Pangloss, who argues that it is really for the best that the man would drown. For Voltaire, the idea that everything happens for the best undermines human agency. It implies that Providence has already set things out in accordance with its supreme values, and we are now powerless to change anything. In the case of Candide, it meant that he let someone die, because if Providence willed it, he would survive, and if Providence did not will it, then it is better that he dies. Voltaire himself seems to consider this his primary critique of Leibnizian optimism, as he closes the book with Candide remarking that instead of trusting in divine laws, we must work to secure our own fate, or, as he puts it, cultivate our garden. I find this an interesting criticism, because optimism is normally considered a spur for action. And indeed, there is some research to suggest it is a spur for successful action. After all, optimists tend to think things will go well, and if you think that everything is destined for the best, then surely you would be very happy to make grand plans and embark on bold decisions. However, Voltaire warns that if this attitude becomes too extreme, it teeters into the idea that, whatever I do, things will ultimately turn out for the best. If we dine too much at the table of optimism, then we will become bloated and complacent, and so passive agents in our own lives. Ironically, this is not unlike the classic picture of a die-hard pessimist. Both the extreme pessimist and the extreme optimist think that there is no point to acting. The first because things will just turn out horribly in any case, and the second because everything is already fated for the best. The idea that our actions have definite effects in the world completely falls away. It is not just a determinist position, but a fatalist one. Secondly, Voltaire thinks that this sort of extreme optimism can become not comforting, but instead cruel. The idea that everything is for the best, or everything happens for a good reason, is often used to console people in times of hardship, but this denies that sometimes things just suck. At another juncture in the novel, a woman is telling the story of her unimaginable hardship. She has been tortured, abused, kidnapped, sold, and everything in between. But the response of Candide, ever the optimist, is to reassure her that this is all for the best, as they live in the best of all possible worlds. The trouble with this position is pretty evident. Sure, it can make reality not seem so bad, but that is cruel to tell someone whose reality actually has been bad. And moreover, it is incredibly difficult to sustain in the face of true suffering. To say to someone who has lost a child or become terminally ill that everything is for the best comes across as almost heartless. It essentially says, sure, you are suffering, but don't you see, you are supposed to be suffering. It is similar to the character of Father Panlu in Albert Camus' The Plague, who initially tries to make sense of the horrible suffering his town is going through by saying that those who have the plague must have sinned and so deserve their fate. Denying the more brutal sides of reality, that there is genuine suffering and pain and death, and that this is by no means for the best, can be just as condescending as it is comforting, and it may stand in the way of us being able to help one another through these troubling times. For Voltaire, the optimist is not just refusing to look reality in the face, but doing so in a way that is intensely damaging, both for their ability to change their own lives and their attitude towards the sufferings of others. Sure, it may help the Leibnizian optimist to think that their own pain is for the best, but as a way of approaching other people, it essentially tells them that they have no reason to be upset. And this both seems unkind and also flies in the face of our intuitions regarding the rationality of holding certain mental states. Sometimes we want to say that it is rational to have been upset. But, to be fair, this sort of retrospective, metaphysically tinged optimism is only one form of the worldview. What about the much more modest idea, not that everything is for the best, but rather that life is a fundamentally good thing and is characterized by pleasure? If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing to my Patreon. The link is in the description. 2. A life of ignorance. It is almost a presupposition of our continued existence that we consider life worth living. If we did not think so, then why are we still here? Why have we not ended it all and re-embraced the strange release of non-existence? The optimistic answer here is that we believe our life is worth living because it is fundamentally good and pleasant. Our lives are likely to go well, and we will get to the end of them having been very glad that we've lived them. However, there are a whole series of philosophers and thinkers that have set out to challenge this view. These are the pessimists, and they have a pretty simple proposition. Life is significantly less pleasant than we tend to think, and some even go so far as to say that it is not worth living. Not just in special cases, but in general. This broad concept comes in many different flavors. We find it in the ancient Buddhist idea that life is characterized by suffering and unsatisfactoriness, or in the Christian idea that we live in a fallen world. But most modern variants utilize the insights of Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's philosophy is pretty complicated and esoteric, but at its base level, it asserts that human experience is defined far more by suffering than by pleasure. I'm also going to draw on some of the work of anti-natalist philosopher David Benatar here, as he is very helpful on this point. Schopenhauer argues that the driving force behind human action is the will, and the will is motivated by desire. Right, so far so obvious. But Schopenhauer points out that having a dissatisfied desire is a very unpleasant experience. We even have a word for it: frustration. The notion of desire being used here is rather broad. So hunger would be classified as a desire because it is an impulse to eat food, as would thirst, the sex drive, as well as emotions like fear, anger, or anxiety. In each case, they signify a need or a want that must be accomplished in order for the pressure of the desire to be alleviated. Moreover, these desires and wants come to us very naturally. We normally do not have to try hard to desire something, but simply find a want appearing spontaneously in our minds, or driven up by some baser instinct, as in the case of hunger. Let's call all of these states of unsatisfied desire frustration, though that is a broader meaning than we normally give to the term. Schopenhauer says that frustration is the characteristic human state. We spend much of our lives largely in a position of wanting something and being put in an unpleasant, frustrated mood. We then go out and achieve that thing and find a brief moment of relief, maybe even active pleasure. However, no sooner has this blissful state arisen than we find a new desire to occupy our minds, and the vicious cycle repeats again. Schopenhauer thinks that we are kept from noticing this by an optimistic bias. Essentially, our mind whispers in our ear that if we only achieve this desire, it will finally let us rest, and we will be free from frustration for an extended period. However, this is a lie. The will has no intention of relenting, and in its raging it will keep us frustrated, clawing for more from life and never truly satisfied. And this is if we are even lucky enough to achieve our desires at all. For most of us, a huge portion of our wishes will be permanently frustrated. There will be jobs we cannot have, achievements we will never accomplish, people we will never get to meet or spend time with or be with. We are rejected, neglected, and eventually left dejected. For Schopenhauer, the optimist is simply lying to themselves. They have no particular reason to believe that their life will be anything other than long periods of frustration and dissatisfaction, with short breaks of relief for a refreshing change of pace, before plunging right back into frustration again. Later pessimists, like Emil Cioran, picked up this theme and called it the frustration of achievement. By contrast, Schopenhauer also thinks that our happy states are significantly less potent than our unhappy ones. Sometimes this is expressed as the claim that happiness is transparent. That is, he denies that pleasure has a positive characterization and says that we do not notice it when it's there. At points, Schopenhauer even treats pleasure as if it was simply the absence of any major negative state. However, we do not need to go nearly that far to cast doubt on the intensity of our pleasure. We could talk about the near universal experience of looking back on a time we once saw as stressful and anxiety-inducing, but viewing it with nostalgia, referring to it as the good old days. We did not see them as such when they were there, and all the pleasure passed us by without notice. So subtle were its effects. It only became apparent when it was contrasted with a far worse situation. In essence, the claim is that states of happiness that are powerful enough to shock us into noticing them, like ecstasy or extreme excitement, are comparatively rather rare, whereas our pains, stresses, and anxieties quite often do distract us and force themselves into our minds, not particularly pleasantly. Moreover, David Benatar also argues that since we have a positive duty to prevent pain, but not one to cause pleasure, pain must be in some way more bad than pleasure is good. Though his argument for this is complicated. I'm going to do a whole video on antinatalism at some point. You'll just have to bear with me. Or subscribe so that you don't miss it. I feel like I should say that now that I'm a proper YouTuber. The conclusion these thinkers draw is that while we may experience happiness and pleasure, our lives are far more defined by their opposites. And if this is true, it is a real blow to the optimistic worldview. Optimism is normally of the opinion that things will generally go rather well and life will be rather pleasant. However, if Schopenhauer and others like him are correct, then this belief is simply false, and not just false, but way off the mark. Even if optimists were to achieve all of their goals, they still would not be happy. They would be like Tolstoy, lamenting their own misery in a manor house surrounded by glory. For Schopenhauer, optimism is a form of dire self-deception. He does not blame anyone for having it. In fact, he sometimes hints that it is better to have the illusion than face the wicked truth. But at the same time, he probably would call optimists fools. However, there is an obvious response the optimist can take, which is that even if optimism is a delusion, if it's one that is necessary for living and living well, then what's so bad about that? Well, as sympathetic as I am to this answer, there is one incredibly interesting criticism to look at, and it suggests that reckless optimism and outright cynicism are two sides of the same coin. 3. The Optimist and the Cynic. As a general rule, we tend to conceive of optimism and pessimism as if they were two ends along a scale, with something akin to realism lying in the middle. On this model, we would think that someone can be optimistic, but if evidence challenges this view, they will become slightly less optimistic over time, and eventually they may start to become pessimistic. However, in the opinion of Friedrich Nietzsche, this is unlikely to be how things turn out. Because for him, someone is far more likely to go from relentlessly optimistic straight to relentlessly pessimistic than find a sensible middle position. And in looking at this, we can learn some fascinating lessons that transfer to other philosophical issues as well. Nietzsche primarily uses this in his analysis of nihilism, but it is equally applicable to pessimism. According to Nietzsche, when someone loses their faith in objective meaning or God, they are not likely to immediately come to a sensible, re-examined position on the topic, unless they just so happen to have a natural zest for life or a particularly organized and strengthened will. Instead, Nietzsche predicts that they will become nihilistic and cynical. They will be inherently distrustful of any attempt to reintroduce a sense of purpose to their lives. Because they have been burned before. They had an idealized but illusory position on the world that they leaned very heavily on. And when this was shattered, they were not only left without a replacement, but with a total lack of faith in meaning at all, even meaning they could craft for themselves. Nietzsche argues that most people would only be able to create their own meaning through self-overcoming once they get over this initial pitfall, and many just never will. Or if they do, it is not because they will have truly learnt to make their own values, but rather because they have leapt into the arms of another grand illusion to keep them happy. I really enjoy this analysis of nihilism, and its insights are not limited to the particular case of meaning. If we zoom out in scope, Nietzsche is arguing that when someone buys into an idealized version of the world, they always run the risk of that worldview collapsing, and with nothing to take its place, they are likely to then fall into despair. It is similar to how sometimes people will fall head over heels for a partner, but then run at the first sign that they have some flaw. The lover was not dealing with the person as they actually existed, but with an idealized, crystallized version of them. When that image was shattered, they fell out of love just as easily as they fell into it. They do not simply revise their image of that person, but rather the whole edifice comes crashing down. And if we accept that some forms of optimism are illusory, that is, they see the world as better than it actually exists, then Nietzsche's criticism becomes particularly pertinent for examining the optimistic position. Obviously, this will hold to very different extents for different levels of optimist. At the extreme end, imagine someone who thinks that the world is perfect. Then it may only take a small crack in their worldview to plunge them into misery. This happens at various points in Voltaire's Candide, as our protagonist struggles to maintain his optimism in the face of the awful things that happen both to him and to the people he loves. Likewise, if we took someone who thought that life was going to be much easier and happier than it actually is, then they might be woefully unprepared for just how difficult things can get. Thus, when life becomes hard, even temporarily, then Nietzsche predicts they are more likely to collapse into despair, as not only are they going through a difficulty, but their entire worldview is falling apart. In such a situation, they might very quickly go from life is incredibly easy to life is unbearably difficult, and trade in an optimistic illusion for a hopeless position. When their idealized view of the world is shattered, Nietzsche thinks they might lose faith in there being any significant goodness or pleasantness at all. However, it does seem that this critique only really applies to the more extreme of the optimistic standpoints. If we say a moderate optimist only slightly overestimates how pleasant life and the world are going to be, then it will be much harder to shatter that illusion, since it is much closer to the truth. It is a bit like how various Christian thinkers have argued it is much easier to break someone's faith if they have a caricatured idea of what God is, like an old man who lives in the clouds, than someone with a thoroughgoing appreciation of the theological nuances around his nature. Personally, I am an atheist, but I think this is a pretty neat observation, since it shows that the further our ideas depart from a plausible reality, the more fragile they become. I particularly like Nietzsche's criticism for two reasons. The first is that it's not suggesting optimism is a poor worldview in and of itself, but rather that it is potentially quite delicate, and the thing that might replace it is extraordinarily awful. In Nietzsche's view, a nihilistic or pessimistic standpoint is to be avoided at all costs because he sees them as fundamentally life-denying. For him, the reason that optimism can lead to pessimism is simple. Because optimism refuses to engage with the world as it actually exists, we never learn to love and appreciate life as it is, but rather as we wish it would be. Thus, we never develop his coveted trait of amor fati, or loving our fate. When the scales fall from our eyes, we become disillusioned with the world as it actually is, and start to resent it with our pessimism. But this too is not engaging with and embracing reality, but rather rejecting it as unacceptable. And funnily enough, I think that Nietzsche himself is very well placed here to give us a way of moving past this sort of unreal or naive optimism, and towards one that can keep as many of the upsides of the fantastical optimistic worldview as possible, while avoiding its rather spacious pitfalls. 4. Post-optimistic optimism. As I said at the start of the video, I am an optimist, but I also recognize the merits in some of these philosophical criticisms of optimism. So, on the face of it, I am in a bit of a pickle. On the one hand, I do want to hold on to my optimism, and I may even be dispositionally stuck with it. But I also do not want to be in an unjustifiable position. So, what are we to do? Luckily, we can draw on some of the very same thinkers who have been criticizing optimism to rehabilitate it into a slightly more robust philosophy. On the face of it, basically all of the critiques thus far have stemmed from a single source: the fact that optimism is, in some sense, overestimating reality. For Voltaire, this was because he thought we clearly do not, in fact, live in the best of all possible worlds. For Schopenhauer, it was because we are mistaken about the quality of our lives and so are just fooling ourselves. For Nietzsche, it was because we are prevented from embracing the world as it actually is, and as a result, this sets us up for later pessimism and nihilism. So, presumably, our goal is to find a version of optimism that is not overestimating what is, but rather accepting what is and nonetheless retaining some of the optimistic spirit, if that makes sense. So, let's dial back optimism into the idea that life is going to be worth embracing in spite of its unpleasant aspects. In this case, we can take a leaf from Nietzsche and Camus' book and ask how we can make the sufferings of the world worth living through and embracing. I will warn you, this is going to be more of a beginning of a thought than a completed idea, but please do run with it and develop it however you wish. As with quite a lot of these videos, I largely intend this to be an aid in your own thinking. In Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, he defines one characteristic of the Übermensch as the ability to not deny anything about life, yet at the same time rejoice in its most difficult aspects. In effect, he proposes a radically different approach to the kind of optimism we have been looking at. This optimism is not a proposition about the world, but rather one about the self. This is also found in his concept of amor fati that we mentioned earlier. Nietzsche suggests that we must look at life head-on, warts and all, but learn to love it nonetheless. There are various methods he toys with that might achieve this. Towards the beginning of his corpus, he proposes that we might turn our lives into works of art and lend meaning to the pain of our existence by immersing it in a sort of narrative. Later on, he suggests that by strengthening and organizing our wills and mastering and harnessing our own deep-rooted instincts, we will become much more able to stare down suffering and hardship without losing our lust for life. This is not a far cry from an optimistic outlook, but rather than saying the world is better than it is, the idea is instead, the world is a mixture of good and bad properties, and yet I've learnt to rejoice in it all regardless. We see a similar idea in Camus' absurdism. While Camus' philosophy is normally applied to problems of meaning and the idea that we should learn to affirm and enjoy life in spite of its inherent emptiness, the same approach could also be used to craft an optimistic outlook on suffering. This is evident in some of his later works, such as The Plague. In that story, an epidemic hits the town of Oran and causes widespread chaos, death, and suffering. Camus examines many different approaches to this, like the kind of optimism where the destruction is justified and the one that overestimates the future. Yet, ultimately, he dismisses both of them for very similar reasons we have given here. Towards the end of the novel, he gives us the closest thing to a thesis statement. We can neither deny suffering nor try to justify it, for it is often truly senseless. Yet, at the same time, he does not conclude that life is no longer worth living. Instead, he asks us again to imagine Sisyphus happy. But rather than this simply referring to the pointlessness of his task, it also addresses how agonizingly painful it would be to roll a boulder up a hill constantly for eternity. This certainly sounds something like optimism, manifesting as a stubborn wish to reaffirm life in the face of difficulty. To draw from another of Camus' works, The Rebel, he says that sometimes a very human reaction to the metaphysical injustices of the world is to live in order to rebel against it. In either case, Camus presents the pains of life as a challenge to the human will. Perhaps inspired by Nietzsche, he wants us to embrace the situation nonetheless, despite all of its suffering. We also see this theme all through the myth of Sisyphus, from the injunction to value the quantity of life regardless of its quality, to the famous phrase, "Imagine Sisyphus happy." Like Nietzsche, he is an optimist not in the sense of viewing the world as better than it is, but rather in his faith that we can learn to love reality not in spite of its difficulties, but partly because of them. It's a very tricky concept to get your head around, and I'm not quite sure how much I would buy into it. Say I was diagnosed with a terminal illness tomorrow. Could I really rejoice in that? Either way, the difference in structure from our original optimist definition is clear. This is almost a second-order optimism. It does not make predictions that the world will be very good or declare that everything is metaphysically for the best. But it is rather a personal commitment to find ways to make our own suffering meaningful and bearable. To make our struggles a project, as Sartre might say. Obviously, the particular way in which we might do this is certainly individual, and neither Camus nor Nietzsche give a clear step-by-step guide. But I do think this is a potential way forward for the optimist philosophy. Now, we are no longer being deluded about the world, but rather seeing it clearly, with an active view to try to love some of its worst characteristics. Camus and Nietzsche are both well aware that this is not an easy task, but their argument is more pragmatic than anything else. We are stuck in this world, and there is no one coming to rescue us. So, we have a few options. We can try to lie to ourselves about the nature of reality. We can give in to despair when this illusion fails. Or we can choose to affirm life for its own sake. In a world without given values, this seems like a perfectly sensible maneuver, and it is the one that Nietzsche and Camus recommend. But, to end on a counterpoint, isn't this just cope? If the world is not primarily good and life is not primarily pleasant, wouldn't it just be irrational to try and love it? Are Camus and Nietzsche just replacing one kind of illusion, one about the world, with another kind, about somehow embracing it fully despite all its difficulties? For them, it does not matter. Since there are no objective values, we are radically free to choose what we value, and the only limit is what we can practically undertake. I will leave it up to you to decide just how plausible this idea is. On the other hand, if they are right, then it provides the optimist with a glimmer of hope. Because even if it turns out that we are initially delusional about the world, there may still be a way we can justify a positive outlook. One that takes full stock of reality and still decides to affirm life. But if you want to learn more about Camus' particular approach to philosophy, then check out one of my oldest videos to look at my analysis of the myth of Sisyphus, arguably his most influential philosophical work. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.